All right, Ryan. Welcome to the Hub. Excited to have you on.
Thanks. I'm very excited to be here. This is my first podcast. I've never been on a podcast. So you're breaking me in, man.
Well, you being a economics professor, I'm sure this won't be your last opportunity to speak to. I'm going to refer to myself as the media.
Okay.
My
Yeah, sure.
it's not quite, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, but I'm right there. I'm right
You'll
there.
get there.
I am getting. I'm getting there. So, um, but yeah, why? Before we dive into the real, our real theme or topic of discussion, which is going to be science and innovation, we're just going to do like a little like lightning round, couple of questions. Just kind of get the audience used to you, and you can kind of get a little bit more comfortable with the whole talking to the media.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. Let's do it.
So you're kind of a big soccer buff. Um, U.S. men's national team is has a lot of young guys. We had a very disappointing, didn't make the World Cup in was that 2018,
Yep.
and everyone was kind of like so frustrated, like, man, we hear always we're gonna be good, and then we like can't even make the World Cup. We lose to like Trinidad and Tobago. So why is this time any different? Well, should we be excited about the U.S. men's national team? And if so, why?
I think we should be excited just because it's a fun team. I mean, it's weird. I follow a lot of sports, but for some reason, like U.S. soccer really brings out the best of my sports fandom. It's like I think just because it's your country, you
No,
feel like you're in there, with the guys. Like you're definitely part of the team. Um, and we get a little bit of that with the Olympics, but like soccer, I don't know, it's like there's a big global following, so that's the fun part of it for me. In fact, I remember Matt. Actually, I think the last like exciting moment of the men's national team, you were with me watching in my parents' basement in 2014 when John Brooks scored against Ghana
I
in
remember.
the group stage. Yeah, we were watching that game together. So
Well, having both of us served our LDS missions in Africa, we definitely, soccer is sometimes it's an escape for people there, right? Like it's,
yeah,
you
big
know,
time.
they're born in pretty adverse conditions, poverty, not great stuff, and soccer is an escape. Everyone plays it, and like I said, there's a huge global following. It stirs a little bit of that nationalism, that national
Yeah,
pride. Some people are scared of, nationalism's not great, but or is it? That's kind of the
yeah,
debate. Anyways, so what about? So why? So should we be excited? Do we have good talent? This, as
right. Yeah, so since that time, I mean, we lost we've gone through a couple coaches since then. Of course, we failed in qualifying last time around, which was a big blow, and that was tough because actually we were like right on the line, and then we lost, like you said, to Trinidad and Tobago, and I couldn't even watch that game because it was like they didn't even have it on TV. It was like it was such a I mean, it was just a no-brainer that we were going to get through. We had a number of young guys. There were some coaching problems in that qualifying run up, so that was tough. But since then, the team has completely changed. So John Brooks is the only one who's really kind of still hanging around. Maybe Josie Altidore, but it's mostly like a bunch of 20, 22-year-old guys who have a lot of them have come up through Europe. So you'll start to, if your listeners haven't heard some of these names, like I think they will in the next few years. That's why it's exciting. So they're playing at big clubs. That's the cool thing. We've had in the past guys on our team play in Europe. Clint Dempsey did a stint over there with teams like Fulham. But you have guys like Christian Pulisic, who's like having big minutes and impact minutes at Chelsea. They're going to the Champions League final in a couple weeks. You've got other guys like Gio Reyna, who's at Dortmund coming up. Serginho Dest plays good minutes at Barcelona. So these are like teams these are like they're in like the big clubs as young talent. We just have never had that in the U.S. system before.
Yeah, Christian Pulisic scored in the quarter semifinals,
Yeah,
Champions League. The Champions League, for those that people don't know, is kind of like Super Bowl, I guess you could compare it to. It's like takes all the best teams in Europe and they like duke it out, and
yeah.
a lot of money on the line. And for Pulisic to play, I think he started in the semis, scored a goal, and then he came off the bench in uh, the
Was
quarter.
second leg. So they do this kind of 2 game
Right.
series basically. And so in
Right.
the second game, he came off the bench and had a perfect assist. I mean, it was just fantastic. Looked
Yeah.
great.
So I mean, it's and like you said, it's like this first time we've had an American who's really played at the top clubs and had like good minutes, not like
Yeah.
garbage
Like
minutes.
impact. I mean, like creating goals, and like helping his team advance to the finals. That's like, yeah, it's just fun, So especially, I think because the U.S. team is also young. I mean, really, like when we start World Cup qualifying in September, I think you'll see that, 9 or 10 of the starters will be like younger than 23. It's just like a totally a youth team, which it's hard to project how they'll do this year. I think they should make the World Cup given the talent they have, but they have to learn how to play as a team. And, that's going to come down to coaching and system. And honestly, sometimes the US struggles a bit with that. Like we don't have the same world class kind of coaching and tactics as other countries. But if we can put it together and qualify, I think they can a chance to have a good run. And then the really cool thing is that in 6 years, the World Cup is going to be in the U.S. Or in North America. Some games in Mexico and Canada, but that could be like the core of our team in like the prime of their careers, having been in the system for many years. So that could be like our chance to really do well. I don't know if they'll ever like make a World Cup final or something or win even, but I think that'll be the best chance we've ever seen and maybe we'll ever see in our life. I don't know.
I'm planning on going. I already told my wife like, hey, 2026, I'm going to some World Cup games. Like, yeah, I'm
For
going.
sure. I'll be there.
It's gonna be pretty awesome. All right, well that's good intro. Get people excited about World Cup, U.S. men's national team. Maybe could you say one quick line of why the Super League, what your opinion was on maybe a lot of sports people heard about the Super League. Why was that a bad idea?
Yeah, so I'll try to make this like accessible to American audience because like our sports system is in some ways very different than in Europe. I think this is just a fascinating story in part because I'm an economist and there's like lots of interesting economics to how these things play out in sports. So, briefly, the way to set it up is that there's a bunch of domestic leagues in Europe. The Premier League in England, you've probably heard of, and then other countries, Germany, Spain, Italy, France have the big kind of leagues, but every country actually has their own league, and the teams are are good in the bigger leagues. And they usually play, just each other. Liverpool and Manchester City and Chelsea all play each other a lot in their domestic league. On top of that, as you mentioned, there's something called the Champions League, where the winner of each of those leagues qualifies for the next year to play all the other champions. Now, they've actually, since in the past couple of decades, added other teams. So, like the top four in England get to play in. And that's pretty exciting. That adds a lot of stakes to the domestic league because they're really all the teams are gunning to be in that top four. Even if you don't win the league, it's actually if you get a top four spot, that's huge because then you get to play in the Champions League next year.
And there's a lot of money
Um,
in the team.
there's a lot of money on the line, so it's like a big deal if you can get in. And some other background, there's throughout European leagues, there's actually also a way to play up into the best leagues for every club. So there's a tiered system where they have promotion and relegation. So there's like 4 big tiers of English football. And if you're in the bottom tier, if you win the bottom league, then the next year you get to move up into the next league. It would almost be like if the Sacramento Bees could like win the Pacific Baseball League and then like the next year they're playing in the American League or whatever. And so that's a very open system, and that's like a big part of soccer culture is like you want to avoid relegation where if you're at the bottom of the league you have to go back down, and it adds a lot of interest for the fans. What the Super League is trying to do is import some of the American system to Europe, and it's gotten a lot of backlash, understandably. So in U.S. we have this closed system where if you're in one of the 30 teams in the NBA, you're always in, right? You're not, there's no threat of relegation. Even if you're the worst team, you actually get a lot of money because they share the money around a lot. And so that's like for the owners, it's great because you're like you're kind of set in terms of risk. You're not worried about losing your way out of your investment, basically. So what they're trying to do in Europe is like a bunch of teams basically wanted to they wanted to quit the Champions League, so to speak, or at least work alongside of them, do their own thing. So six teams in England, three in Spain, three in Italy got together and said, "We're going to form the Super League. We don't care what everyone else says. We're always going to be in the Super League. No matter we can't get relegated out of it, and we're going to play each other more every year, and that's going to be good for soccer because it will like create a lot more chances to see Real Madrid play Manchester United and AC Milan to play Atletico Madrid and all this. So you would get more of those top teams playing each other, but it would lower the stakes, right? And that's what the fans are mad about is that the cool thing about the Champions League is that it's hard to get in and you have to play your way into it. There's a lot of stakes for the fans that's really exciting. And so they actually, they bristle at the American system where it's like you can have the New York Knicks languish at the bottom of the league for decades and they still get a bunch of money, but their fans are just ticked off about it every year. So even the fans of these big clubs didn't really like the proposal, but the owners sort of are just trying to take a stab and grab as much money as they can basically by creating their own little cartel of soccer teams basically.
Very good point. Well said. Um, you know, I'll take the other side of the argument and say,
Yeah.
if I look at the NFL and I sent you a chart, the
Hmm.
average game of the NFL generates like $60 million in revenue. Just one game of the
Yeah.
NFL. And I'll put the chart on the podcast description. Whereas the Premier League, which has a ton more fans, right? A lot more people watch soccer than they do American football, only generates like 10 or $12 million.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think last year like 350 million people watched the Champions League final or something like that compared to 100 million for the Super Bowl, but they make a bunch more money.
they make a bunch more money, and so this is why Americans' system of soccer, the closed system, was like the owners were, and a lot of the owners of these sports
Yep.
teams are
Yeah,
American.
that should be mentioned.
They're being financed by American banks, J.P. Morgan
Yep.
Chase, Goldman. Um, they're looking at this and saying, well, this is an inefficient market here. We're playing, Manchester City's playing like Aston Villa, like no one really cares about watching watch that game. The guy made
Yep.
the argument, one of the owners made the argument like no one tunes in to see Roger Federer play like the 180th ranked person in the world. They tune in though when it's Federer versus Nadal, and that's kind of the idea behind the Super League is like, hey, let's have more games where people are going to tune in more. We can charge higher, rights for the TV rights, make more money, and then ultimately that benefits soccer overall as there's more money in the system. Um, so, tough question. I don't want to spend a ton of time more on this, but
Yeah.
there is another side to this argument. It was like, hey, look, the NFL has a lot less viewers, but they make like 4 or 5 times per game just off TV rights because the market is closed. So something for the audience to think about.
Do I get to respond or we shouldn't
Yeah,
we
sure.
shouldn't labor
Okay,
on this?
30-second
Quick,
response.
30 seconds. Okay, one is that first of all, if you've ever watched an NFL game, most of it's advertisement. So that's one of the main reasons why
That's
it's
true. There's a
different
lot
per
more
game.
stop,
There's
stop.
a lot more stop and start where they stick ads, and you don't have to deal with that in soccer. The other thing is just that I think there's big benefits to having stakes. It's like we wouldn't necessarily tune in to see Federer and Nadal play every other weekend just because they're making a cash grab, right? So in some ways, like the Champions League is great because we care if they win or not because they could lose out next year or whatever. But I don't actually disagree that I think they could reform the system so that you do see those big teams playing each other more. They're actually trying to make some changes to Champions League so that they would have more like a group stage or something where you'd see more rotation of the top teams. Bayern Munich playing Chelsea and then next week they maybe are playing Madrid or whatever. So they're trying to change the format so you get more of those games. I think the main thing, the bottom line question is just like, should we let teams like say Arsenal just have a spot in there every year? It would be like if the Lakers said, if you don't let us play in the playoffs every year, we're gonna like quit and start our own league. And so just from like a competitive perspective, I think there's lots of reasons why we don't want to allow that to happen. In fact, that's one reason why the US regulates their sports so much is because this actually used to happen in baseball. The National League was started as like a breakaway attempt for a few teams to like keep the best players. And Congress stepped in and basically said, we're not going to let just anyone start their own league because it has like bad effects on the competitive environment. So, it's sort of there's actually lots of, like I said, interesting economics about how it worked. It was interesting to see it all unravel because like there's some game theory also of like which teams wanted to get out, which were the first teams in and last teams out because it all kind of unraveled. But anyway, you make some valid points. I'm not saying it's like a perfect system, and there's a little bit of best of both worlds, which I think is interesting to think about.
Interesting. Well, that is super interesting. Having been to England a couple of times, I love the Premier League. Like, just
Yeah.
the names and the clubs. They're just awesome. So, well, thanks for sharing your wisdom. Quite the sports buff. In addition to being an economist. So let's pivot a little bit more to like the heart of like what this episode's about. So you deal with science and innovation policy. So could you maybe explain that for our listeners? Like, what
Yeah.
do you mean?
Right. So I'm an economist. So, we think a lot about obviously topics like supply and demand, markets, how we organize capital and labor to create growth and GDP. And, there's lots of topics. There are some economists who study kind of human behavior, how we make decisions and things like that. So I focus on innovation and science, and innovation is a big part of economics. So the reason we have GDP growth every year, for example, in good years, is because technology improves the way that we can turn raw materials and labor into products and things that are that we need to survive and we enjoy. And a lot of that, comes from how do we get, the questions are how do we get new ideas? Who comes up with inventions? What do we do to encourage invention? And so those are topics that I study. I focus more specifically on science. There's sort of a dividing line between basic research, which often happens in universities or government labs, and then applied research or development, which can happen in companies, right? Those are like companies who are making patents, pharmaceuticals, technology, all those things. So those are important topics. I am interested in science a lot because it's sort of a different set of, most scientists don't get patents. There's different reasons that they come up with ideas. And so I study things like how do labs choose which projects to tackle? How do they compete with each other? There's actually quite a bit of competition between scientists over who's publishing and what they're publishing. I look a lot at scientific careers, how we train, PhD researchers, and how we organize the labor basically within an academic system. So those are some of the topics that I work on. But yeah, science and innovation in general is what I do.
So are you looking at you're looking at scientists or labs, university labs?
Mostly universities is what I focus on, although there are other types of, like I said, government labs, and especially in other countries,
Oh, right.
there may be more like, directly funded basic research. But again, one of the defining thing, or one of the ways I would define what I look at is sort of academic research, or what we call basic research, is often very far from the technological boundary. So it's like far from commercialization. So instead of studying like people who come up with new cell phone apps or new radar technology that might be commercialized immediately, I'm sort of interested in how do we come up with the ideas and science that undergirds that research in the future. Things like mathematicians, biologists, chemists, they're working on things that aren't necessarily ready to commercialize, and that has a big effect on how we fund them and how they're incentivized. So a chemist in a university lab often will just be trying to solve a problem that's important for the world to understand, but they can't necessarily sell that idea, that it's not ready for commercialization. And so as a government or just as a society, we have to think about how do we encourage those ideas? Because, the invention of calculus, for example, happened 400 years ago. It was not something that you could go and sell in the market in 16, in the 1600s, but it's
Right.
hugely important for everything that we do now. And so if Newton had never come up with some of those ideas, we would be much further back in our sort of economic development. And so we need to think not just like in the next 5 years, what technologies are we going to get, but in the next, 20, 100 years, what are we doing now to learn about science and technology that will be useful then?
Great point. So let me, so undergirding this kind of uh, process, and so kind of what we want to talk about is, so should government be the one funding, and how much, if government should be funding this innovation, how much should they be doing? And, because Newton, your thing with Newton, right? Newton was, he wasn't in a government lab. He just kind of discovered it himself. He wasn't part of a
Yeah.
university, thing, university lab or anything like that. 22 years old in his dorm room, calculus. He's one of my personal heroes, honestly.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You
Uh,
love those old geniuses that just sort of like sat under the apple tree and came up with the, world-changing discoveries. But
so yeah, so why and how much should government be involved in science and technology? And does this crowd out, private investment?
yeah,
And could you maybe speak about, is this efficient? Because governments are
yep,
not known to be efficient. So how
yep,
do you manage public investment, I guess?
yeah. So it's a tricky problem because we do think that private companies can produce a lot of innovations, and and they often do. There's sort of a fundamental challenge with knowledge, sort of markets for ideas. So unlike a market for cars, where a company can build cars and sell them for a certain price to an individual, we often say that knowledge is a public good. So if I produce a new invention, I don't just give it to individuals and sell it to certain people. It actually sort of goes to the whole world. Everyone benefits from the invention, which is a great thing about science. I mean, and ideas. They're free. They're sort of have a low cost to spread to other people. I just have to tell you what the idea is, and then you can benefit from it, use it to make a new product. But it's also hard to control, right? So a company doesn't get all of the benefits from the innovations they make, typically, because everyone else can use it. And so what that means is that we have lower incentives to produce than we want. That's one way to think about it, is the social returns to ideas are much greater than the private returns. And so that means that like we're not going to reach the sort of equilibrium amount or sort of efficient amount of innovation if we just let people do it, freely in a free market. So we fix some of those problems with like patents in a private market. The same problems though happen for basic research, but again, the problem is that those aren't ready to commercialize. So I can't actually give a patent to like a mathematician. Let's say a mathematician comes up with some, new way to invert a matrix or something, some proof that's very useful, but it's not like you can sell it immediately and everyone's going to benefit from it. And so someone has to encourage that person to come up with that theory. We would get some of them on their own. Like it's true that some people just like solving science problems. And back in the day, maybe Newton was one of those people. But in sort of a modern economy, we have to think about ways to structure a labor market so that people will like put a lot of effort into solving hard math problems, basically, or science biology problems. Also, a lot of these fields need a lot of equipment, and they need teams of people working. So we're sort of far removed from the old model where people would just come up with ideas and put them in their book and call it a day. So, why does the government need to participate in that? It's really because there are very few ways to sort of build that system from a private market sort of profit maximizing position, because firms just they don't care enough about how other people are benefiting from their ideas. It's like, why should I spend, why should I invest a $500 million in like biology labs to come up with ideas that our investors will never see the profits of, right? It's like they're always thinking about, the next 5, 10, maybe 15 years. But if these benefits are going to go 30 years in the future and all over the world, they don't have the incentive to do it. So universities participate in this, but we support universities a lot through government grants. Governments are supposed to have like they're supposed to be very forward looking, right? They're sort of thinking about what's the good of society, how can we benefit future generations, and so they're the ones that really have the incentive to put it in, and that's why you see like President Biden is proposing, a very large infrastructure investment into science and research in general. Something like $250 million, or quarter. What was it? I always get the B's and the T's mixed up on these. $250 billion was his investment proposed. So, I think it's efficient because private companies just won't do it. It's very different than other markets where, the free market just sort of finds the profit or sort of the efficient amount of a product to make. With ideas, we almost always need someone like the government to encourage it, just because it's so valuable to the society.
So if I could sum up the argument, it's basically there's benefits outside of just the transaction. When you buy a car, you get the benefit of it. But
Yep.
like when you get an education, you benefit, but also your family benefits, society benefits from that education, and maybe education is underinvested because there's these extra benefits to society that aren't
Yeah.
captured in the transaction, and so government should help step in so that uh, people and society can realize those extra benefits.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's even more than just education. It's good to teach people like
Oh,
skills and
yeah.
teach people how to code and things like those are all good things for the government to invest in. But even more particularly, like we need to encourage people to come up with new ideas. That's how the economy grows. And there are some areas of innovation where firms will do that, but there are just many areas that firms will just be hands off. There's just like we just can't, like no company wants to like pay for a bunch of mathematicians to solve problems that many of them may never come to be used. That's the hard thing, is like innovation is so risky that it's hard to say like, 100 years from now someone will benefit from solving this math problem. No firm is interested in participating in that market. They just don't get the benefits to it. And so we've come up with ways to, in some ways they're sort of weird. It's like even nonprofit universities are sort of a weird structure of like, these guys are gonna and gals are gonna spend half their time teaching classes, and the other half of their time they're sort of solving these very esoteric problems. And that's just one way that we figured out to fund it. But basically, society doesn't have any obvious, like very natural ways to create these new ideas, and so that's why governments have stepped in. But you also asked like how much is enough. That's a very hard question. How do we know, whether we should be spending 250 billion? Should we be spending a trillion? Should we be spending $10 trillion on funding research? That's actually a very hard problem. I think my sense is always like we could spend more. This is like my favorite thing that a politician has proposed in the past 10 years. I mean, obviously biased, but
Yeah,
I
yes.
just think it's, I just think it's so important to really, especially even on the world stage, to be competitive in technology in the future. We have to make these investments, buy equipment, fund salaries for lab workers, and all these types of spending. And I think there is good evidence in the economics literature to suggest that we get a lot of benefit. Even applied benefit, even like patenting, for example, benefits a lot from basic research. One study says like for every $100,000 of NIH, National Institutes of Health funding, we get like 1.2 patents down the road. They're not being made in these labs, but like the papers that these labs write with NIH grant funding goes on as inputs into important technologies. The mRNA vaccine is a great example of that. That's a private company who created the vaccine, but it's built on decades and decades of research about how mRNA works, and how it can affect our cells, and how it could be used as a therapeutic. That's a mixture of a bunch of public funded basic research that's then been translated into private sort of private R&D that's now benefiting the world in a huge way.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I guess the one counterpoint or the one point I would raise is uh, governments aren't known to be efficient, and I wonder
Yeah.
if there's a way to see, you know, yeah, this $250 billion is great, but if we gave if instead of taxing, right, because that spending's got to come from somewhere. You either got to print more dollars, inflation, or you got to
Yep.
tax it to fund this research. If that $250 billion was left in the hands of Google, Amazon, Google has their own kind of secret Project X, I think is what they're
Yeah.
called, where they're doing a lot of the same stuff,
Yeah.
albeit maybe not chemistry, biology, things like that. Uh, so I'm wondering, if you looked at Google's, 20 years of doing research,
Yeah.
how many patents did they generate versus like a government lab?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But the other thing I think about a lot of, because I kind of go back and forth on this quite a bit, because like I look at like Israel, right? And Israel has a strong uh, tech innovation, like a lot of startup culture. And but this is according to the research I've done, so I could be wrong. And a lot of like the tracking technology that like basketball teams use now, that
Hmm.
technology is actually from Israel. And from my research, I think that a lot of that research, a lot of that basic understanding happened in the military first. Like the
Hmm.
military kind of developed it, and then the guys, in Israel, you have to be part of the military for a couple of years. And I think a lot of these like the basic technology for tracking like missiles or keeping track of stuff happened there in Israel and the national government for defense. And then it seems like guys knew about it, went to the private sector, created their own startup that used a lot of similar technology, came over to the U.S. and sold that technology to the basketball teams, so basketball teams could have like all the stats on like
Hmm.
and whatnot. So in my mind, I'm like, oh, there seems to be some real benefit here. Whole development, whole side of business was created because the government was funding, you know, in Israel's case, national defense, like
Yeah.
their defense. But then I also look at like, you know, Germany in the 1940s, like they were doing a ton of government research too, but that's not something we would say
What?
this is something
Yeah.
we want governments to be investing in too. So it's
Yeah.
kind of like, okay, well maybe whereas in a private company, right, there seems to be, I don't know,
No, no.
you get
These
what I'm
are
saying?
great. These are good questions. I mean, like one question is like, what type of innovations get funded by a government? Uh, this gets moves into the political realm, which I'm much less of an expert on. It's sometimes confusing to me as how we make decisions. In politics, but definitely there are different priorities, and the different parties will sort of struggle over this. There have been for example, proposals in our government to provide more funding towards applied innovations. Some people would say we're spending too much money on like, sort of university lab research. Maybe they're not working on the right problems. We need things that are like, we need to deliver for Americans like useful technologies. I remember like Jeff Flake had this like government waste book of like all the projects funded by NIH that he thought were like useless or sort of like too esoteric to be worth the taxpayer's dollar. I think that that's possible. That is obviously it's a hard problem to know what to spend the money on. The military does participate in it to some degree. They still do in the U.S. And obviously, we've gotten a lot of good innovations that are originally intended for the military, like radar, came out of a lot of government funding for military research, but that has been now applied to many useful technologies for just commercial life. And so it's hard to know where to put the dollars, and different people in politics have different priorities about that. In fact, a lot of the this 250 billion investment proposal is sort of a counter offer to what Congress had proposed already, which was to spend a lot more money towards technology, giving it to companies, giving it to like specifically for more applied innovations. So those are definitely details that have to get sorted out, and different stakeholders have a lot of opinions about, what's the best place to put money. It isn't actually. One other thing I'll say is you brought up a good point about private companies. Google, for example, does spend money on basic research. So it seems that there are some settings where private companies can produce really good basic science. There's some good historical examples like Thomas Edison and Bell Labs and some of these other,
AT&T.
they actually were doing not just very applied. They didn't just invent the telephone, but they invented a lot of other useful technologies that we've since taken advantage of. A lot of people think, economists a lot of times think that those can only happen with like big monopolies. Google, I would say, is a big monopoly. So basically, they have a slush fund that they can throw around on interesting projects,
Yeah.
which is a good thing, but that there are costs to allowing monopolies as well. So it's sort of like, should we, is the cost going to come from taxpayers? Is it going to come in these big monopolies? There's always going to be a trade-off, and so we need policymakers who will think through that and decide what's the right balance.
Well, and that's why I love economics, because it identifies the trade-off, and a lot of times these trade-offs aren't discussed, and when
Yep.
politicians talk about it. And this kind of brings me to my final point. Uh, one of the things we've talked about is how much should politicians, there was a phrase that came up in this pandemic where throughout it was, oh, so and so listens to the science,
Yeah.
whereas, oh, so and so doesn't listen to the science. And really what it was, in my view, was that, some groups were saying, no, this is what we have to do. There's no deviation. Like, this is what the science says. But, you know, anyone who is saying, like, this is the way we have to do it, or this is the only way to solve the problem,
Yeah.
I'm a little skeptical of, because, like, and especially when they don't talk about the trade-offs or, like,
Yeah.
talk about the damage, like, I'm a little skeptical. And, like, the other, let's say just President Trump had other scientists on his team, like, I think there was a Dr. Atlas from the Hoover Institute that was saying, no, we can do it a different way, or we can approach this differently. But he was just getting shouted down.
Yeah.
And, like, so when someone says, oh, they're following science, I'm kind of like, okay, like, I don't believe you, because, like, science is messy, right? Our understanding grows step by step. So what's the interaction between policymaking and basically, funding of research? Because a lot of times politicians have an agenda and they want to advance an agenda. And so, if they're directing the money, the slush fund, to, labs,
Yeah.
hey, do a lot of research about climate change so I can advance, bills that say, like, hey, we need to shut down fossil fuels. We need to do all this stuff. And then I can point to the research and say, well, look, there's research here. There's science here that says we need to do this. So, like, what about that interaction? Like,
Yeah.
what would you say about that?
Yeah. So I think it is it's hard when there's a lot of political forces that push on these things, and they sometimes have the right intentions and they often do not. I agree with you that when people say I'm following the science, they're not being completely, they're not being completely transparent, because science is often not just like a rule book of like, this is how society must behave, because this is that scientists would never say that. Actually, it's often politicians who are interpreting the science will use that to say, like, we have to follow the science. So I think climate change is a good example of that, where it's like a lot of different people can use the idea that the climate is warming, and it's usually, it's probably because of human participation, human industry and things like that. And so, they'll often say we have to do X, Y, and Z because of climate change, but they're not really giving us the trade-offs, right? And economists would get a little frustrated with that argument, because there is a trade-off between the economy and the environment. Even if what I would wish is that we could just say, here's the evidence that we have from science. This is the projection, for example, that climate scientists are giving to it. Not that that's going to be exactly right. That climate science is a very hard
Yeah, very.
area. It's very
Dynamic models
it's
and
yeah, it's very uncertain. It's actually, you can't run climate experiments very well in a laboratory. So it's a lot of conjecture, but also, I do think that they have the right models. And the question for an economist is like, if we shut down our entire economy for good, then yes, the climate will improve. The environment will be better off for it, but humans will suffer greatly because of it, and that's for me what we care about as policymakers is like, how is human society doing? And so, to me, it's like a balance. How can we listen to the projections and say, like, what trade-offs can we make it to move in that direction? I personally am like very in favor of, investing in technologies that will move us away from fossil fuels, or at least towards cleaner fuels. How can we set up sort of, carbon taxation or other types of systems to move us in the direction away from, carbon emissions? And so I think that can be done by just acknowledging what the science has suggested, but not saying like, this is what the science directs us to do, because that's never what a scientist can or should do. The same is true with the pandemic. There were lots of trade-offs to make. Obviously, the scientists were right very much in the fact that it's a contagious and deadly disease. India is going through a very, terrible bout of COVID right now, and so they weren't wrong. But there's also a trade-off to be made of like, again, we could shut our economy down completely, and kill, COVID on the spot. But in reality, we need to let the economy operate to some degree. So there was a lot of balance. There were a lot of trade-offs being made, and both sides have good arguments into how much, you should lock down or enforce mask mandates or whatever it might be, encourage vaccination, versus, how much should we let people have sort of the freedom to operate the way they will in a pandemic. So I always hope that science will just inform the argument, but unfortunately, I think politicians don't, they don't always communicate that correctly. I do actually think, though, that right now on the right wing, for some reason, there are a lot of people who insist on what I would say is science denialism, where they just say, you know what, I just don't think those people are telling the truth. I don't think they are, like, they're trying to destroy the economy for some reason, some malicious reason. And I just think that's not a fair representation of what scientists are trying to do.
right. Yeah. Well, but I mean, you bring up, yeah, no, I totally agree. I think this, and that's a hard thing. That's a hard thing. No one, like, humans don't like trade-offs, right? They don't
Yeah.
like, and that's a hard thing. But I feel like that's the power of economics. So I do think a lot of credibility in the science community has been lost. I mean, there was an article this week that showed that, for schools, right, this the evidence seems to suggest like children don't really like, uh,
Hmm.
and but I don't know. I don't have kids, so I'm not really. But it just seems like schools aren't really a hot spot for spreading the virus. Like, children don't seem to. But schools most over the country are still shut down,
Yep.
and there's not really an acknowledgement of like, well, you know, what's that doing to, children's educations, children's health, mental and physical health, and especially like, disadvantaged or minority children
Sure.
that
Yep.
don't have, it's easy for certain people who, okay, yeah, we have, we're well off, we can hire a tutor or whatnot. But for a lot of other people, like with kids, single mom is raising kids, it's kind of like, what am I going to do with, like,
Yeah.
the child falls further and further behind. But, the story that came out was that the CDC came out with these guidelines, and then like they found out, oh, two of them were written by a politician, like a lobby, the teachers union. And it's
Oh
like,
yeah.
wait a second, like, where's the, and this is the, the credibility factor, I think, has been really damaged. Like, the CDC is like, I think they've taken a real hit credibility wise, because I don't know if they've, tried to overexert influence, or they've let it become too politicized, or like, they're trying to play
Yeah.
favorites here. I think it speaks to the real frustration when politicians weaponize science, I guess is the
Yeah.
I would say it. They don't acknowledge the trade-offs. They don't acknowledge like the you know, hey, maybe there's another way that we can do this, and um, you know, maybe
Yeah,
approach it. So
yeah, I mean, I think honestly, like, uh, one thing I'll say is that the pandemic has been a very hard experience because it's changed so fast, and we've learned a lot from it. So if we think back to March of last year, which is not a comfortable experience, but if you think back to that craziness, I mean, no one knew
yeah, no,
about how the virus even spread, or who it affected the most,
right,
or how long it would be till we had therapies and vaccines. And so we opted for conservatism,
yeah,
which I think was the optimal decision at the time. It's just like we don't know how bad this is going to be, so we need to sort of put all these mandates in place, and we need to close schools and businesses and things like that. The hard thing is that some of these institutions have a very hard time adjusting back. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's the awkwardness that we've been in the past few months, is like, how do we know how soon it's okay to do all these things or open schools? And I think, unfortunately, a lot of one thing I'll say about scientists, and maybe just like, CDC bureaucrats in general, is just that they're very conservative. Only, I mean, in the sense of they're very hesitant to,
one
to open
case,
up.
one case of coronavirus is almost too much because that means it can spread and the spread can be exponential, and then all of a sudden we're back.
Yeah. Yeah, no, again, I think there was a lot of cause for concern. And it's like, as we learn more about it, it's like we do want to be safe, and so it's easy to opt for that. Especially, I think, public health experts, they always are thinking in terms of risk, in terms of the cost. They almost always think of the cost side. There are benefits, but it's very hard to communicate between the two groups what the costs and benefits are. So I agree with you that, like, on school closings, that can be like hugely harmful, to keep kids out of school, I think. And I think there's good research to support that. It's also potentially very harmful for coronavirus to spread uncontrolled, even through schools. Although I think you're right that we've learned that the spread is much lower among children. But who's going to, like, bring those stakeholders together and get them to agree on, like, a schedule? I mean, it's very logistically challenging even to get a schedule of, like, this is when we're going to bring people back. Are the teachers unions going to be willing to do that? I mean, there's so many moving pieces. It's like, it is hard. So I agree, though, that, like, there are some people who will point fingers on both sides, and they have, and that's one of the challenges, I think, of government. And I would just hope that people realize what really frustrates me is when people look at science in general and just say, because they were wrong about one thing, or because I'm just going to, like, shut it all out. Unfortunately, I think there are a lot of people who do that. They just say, I'm never going to believe anything a scientist tells me because they were either wrong on this one thing, or because they're different than me. They went to a fancy school. I just don't need to listen to them. I think there's a huge value to having experts on all of these topics in the world, and we should invest in education to get people to those points. But policymakers need to have some leadership to say, like, these two groups of experts disagree, and I'm going to step in and make a decision here about what is right, and I'm going to explain to the people why that's the right decision. I think that's the type of leadership I look for, when I'm voting. But it's hard to find. I'll be honest.
It really is. Well, I'll just close with this. For our listeners, kind of bringing it back full circle to sports. My wife and I've been watching The Last Dance. I don't know if
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
and when Michael breaks his foot, right? And so I think it's episode 2. Michael Jordan breaks his foot, and he goes down to North Carolina to finish school, and then he starts playing pickup, at the gym. And then the Bulls owners find out, and they're like, Michael, what are you doing? Like, you're injured. You shouldn't be doing it. And
Yeah.
then it goes into this discussion of risk, right? Probability and risk. And it says, like, it was like, what's the percentage that I can play and not get injured? And the doctor says, 90%. And Michael loses it. He's like, what are you guys doing? I'm 90% good. Like, everyone's just focused on the negative. Everyone's focused on the risk. Like, let's 90%. What, like, why are you holding me back? And then the owner, the bull, says, well, what happens to that 10%? Like, what happens to if you that 10% kicks in? Like, what does that mean for your career? And the doctor says, oh, he's done playing basketball. And the way that Michael solves this, well, the owner's like, Michael, if you had, 9 pills that you can take, you had 10 pills, 9 of them would solve your headache, but one of them would kill you. Would you take a pill? And Michael says, well, it depends how effing bad the headache is. And, but
it's hard to think about risk. It's hard.
Yeah, and that speaks to the natural tension of risk, and like, things are risky. Driving a car is risky, but we do it because the benefit far outweighs driving a car. Wearing a mask can keep you, well, I don't want to get into politics, but wearing a mask can prevent spreading, right? Having a face on, but it's what's the benefit? Like, what's it's these trade-offs, and I guess some people would argue government typically does a one-size-fits-all, and it's better if people can make those decisions for themselves. They have a better understanding of the risk reward payoff. But then you also say about if maybe they aren't taking into account the risk well enough, and so maybe government should kind of push or mandate something. And there's no easy answer to that. And
importantly, with the pandemic, it's not just risk to yourself, it's risk to people around you. That's the externality is what makes it very hard to manage a pandemic from a government's perspective. I think they're almost always going to seem more conservative than many people want, because they're trying to help you internalize the risk you're putting on other people, right? And so that's a big challenge that they've had to deal with.
Yep, well said. That's the next point I was going to get, is that there's the other personality. So Ryan, and listeners, thanks for listening. Ryan, thanks for coming on. Hopefully it was enjoyable. Hopefully your first time interacting with the media was good. But
yeah, no, it was fun. I was looking forward to doing it again if you'll ever have me back on. But I've been enjoying the show, so I hope people listen and enjoy as well.
Well, thanks, Ryan. Maybe next time you can tell people why you think I'm a bro. So
give me one opportunity to tell one story. It's a short one. Okay, so Matt Hubbard is a big bro. As you've listened to this podcast, I don't know if you realize that.
Let's say so. I did all the same classes as Ryan. We were both in the linear algebra, calculus together. Real analysis. Yeah, we took mostly all the same classes. So.
I mean, on the intelligence spectrum, you're very high for bro. I mean, you're like way up there, so don't worry about that. You're totally a smart guy. But one time as undergrads, I think it was towards the end, we must have maybe just graduated, or it was like summertime around our senior year. We were going to go golfing. So I called up Matt, said, let's meet at the course. We'll be there at, like 2 p.m. or whatever. So my brother and I are standing there on the first tee, warming up. Here comes Matt to play golf with us. And he rocks up wearing Sperry topsiders with no socks. He's ready to play. No golf shoes, just boat shoes with no socks. And he proceeds to beat us by like at least 5 to 10 strokes. So you put that in your mind to picture how much of a bro Matt was back in the day. But we loved him for it. I'll say that.
I remember that round of golf. It was down at East Bay.
East Bay, yeah.
Well, in my defense, I would say I was super poor then, right? I hadn't really started working, so that's the only pair of shoes I had.
But you couldn't afford socks or what?
Well, you got to be a little stylish on that.
Well, you knew you didn't need it. I mean, obviously, you'd seen my golf game before, so you're just like, whatever. I don't even need to put on socks to like show this guy around. So.
Well, when you're coming out to eat, I'm vaccinated, and I know you are. So if you want to go play around, let's grab your brother and let's do it again. I still don't have golf shoes, but I do have some socks.
Okay, that'd be great. That'd be fun.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Ryan. Thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. We'll see you.
See you later.